So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the spreadsheet. So I have a Google Sheets document open, and I've got, and we'll do the same kind of thing. So if we want to again create the recipe for iron gears, I actually have a little bit of a starter here, just so that we can save a little bit of time and I don't have to type all this as you're watching. So let's say we have a recipe of iron gears. We have a base craft time of 0.5 cycles per craft, what most people say seconds. A base crafting speed of 0.75 cycles per second. So this is the assembler 2, and an output quantity of 1. Now let's say we wanted to... excuse me on that. Let's say we wanted 15 gears per second output. How would we calculate the number of machines needed? I'm just going to make this a green cell, so that's an input cell, or so it's an output cell. This is the information we want out of this, whereas the orange cells are the information we want to type in just for reference or for whatever. So here we do the same thing we did in Windows Calculator, but we just do it in a formula instead. So we start out with the base craft time. We divide that by the crafting speed. And one thing that I like about Google Sheets is it starts to give you the answer here before you even press enter. So 0.667, which is the number we had when we used Windows Calculator. And then we divide that by the output quantity, which is 1 in this case, so there's no change there. And then we multiply that by the desired output, just like we did on the calculator. And we get 10 machines needed. Okay? So now, let's say we wanted... I'm going to grab another copy here. Let's say we wanted to, or we needed to know what we need. What do we want to input here? Well, there's 2 iron plates for every gear, so the recipe says 2 iron plates. And then we'll make this cell green as well. Now, how many iron plates do we need to create 15 gears per second? Well, that formula is pretty simple as well. So we do the 2 iron plates, and we multiply that by the output, and that tells us we need 30 iron plates input. Pretty simple. And if a recipe has more than 1 input, we need to actually alter this formula just a little bit, because we need to lock this to column B. But if a recipe has more than 1 input, we can simply add in a few more columns here with the other input products. So this is the same as we got with the with the calculator, with Windows Calculator. Now, what if we wanted to look at green circuits? They also are 0.5. They are also 0.75 because we're using the same machines. And they also output 1. And we'll say we want 15. So nothing changed here. It's still 10 machines. But we need only 1 iron plate. And we need copper wire. And I think it was 3? Yeah. The recipe was 3. Let me pull that up just so we can see it. Yeah. It was 1 iron plate and 3 copper cable. So, switch back here. I can call it copper cable since that's what it's called in the game. So this tells us that we need 15 iron plates and 45 copper cables in. Okay, but now we need to figure out, okay, how many machines do we need making copper cable? Because you don't bust copper cable. So we can actually just copy this spreadsheet, or this portion of the spreadsheet, down here, and we can say that we want a desired output of copper cable, which is, we pull up Factorio again, and we look at the recipe. 0.5 requires 1 plate, outputs 2 cables. Outputs 2 cables, requires 1 copper plate. Delete that. I could have left the formula there. Doesn't hurt. So, just like we found when we used the Windows calculator, copper cable, in order to produce enough copper cable, which is 45, because I linked it to this cell here, we need 15 machines, which makes sense because it's a 3:2 ratio with green circuits. And each recipe uses 1 copper cable, so that means we need 45 copper plates. That's not right. Or is that right? It is right. Never mind. That means we need... No, that's not right. We don't need that many copper plates. We need half that many copper plates. What am I missing in my formula here? Ah, I know what it is. I need to divide this by the output quantity. Yeah. These formulas actually weren't right. And that formula's not right now, too. Oh, it is there. Okay. Scared me for a second. Okay. So we need half the amount of copper plates because it's a 1:2 craft. So that's a pretty simple spreadsheet that accomplishes exactly what we need. That is, how many machines do we need making green circuits? What type of input are we going to need in order to provide yeah, that's this input row right here. That's the green here. So how many machines we need to provide the item we're trying to provide, and what type of input we need to deal with. So as long as you remember that a yellow belt is 15, a red belt is 30, a blue belt is 45, you can easily convert this into belts as well. Or you could simply divide this and say yellow belts 1, yellow belts 3. So obviously you don't want to deal with 3 yellow belts worth of product here, so doing the direct insert like we demonstrated in the game makes this much more efficient. So now let's look at red science. We looked at red science before. Okay, so it's at a 5-second base craft time. Pull up my notes here so I don't have to keep switching back and forth into the game. Requires 1 copper plate, 1 iron gear, outputs 1, and let's say we want 1.5, just because we don't want 100 machines making this thing. And then this is iron gear, a base craft time of a half a second, 1 output, 2 iron plates, this is linked to there, so that we have the desired output of this goes as an input here. So we can see here that we need 1.5 copper plates per second, and 3 iron plates per second in order to produce 1.5 red science per second. 10 machines making red science, 1 machine making iron gears results in the 1.5 red science per second that we were looking for. So we can keep going with this. I mean, we could do green science. We'll have to actually look up the recipe for green science. Green science's recipe is 6 seconds. It needs 1 transport belt and 1 inserter. Oops. Learn how to spell, Wally. Green science is 6.75, outputs 1. We'll do the same desired output. Let's see, this was transport belt and inserter. All right, so the transport belt has a craft time of 0.5, requires 1 plate, 1 iron plate, and 1 gear wheel. 1 iron plate, 1 iron gear. So half a second divided by the 0.75 divided by 1 output means we need 1 machine in order to make that. So now we need to wait a minute. Let me make sure I got this on the right. I do not have this on the right cell. Not that it matters because it's the same, but it should be accurate. So this means we need 1.5 iron gears per second. Iron gears a half, 1 and 2 here. So just to produce the transport belt portion of green science, we need 1 machine making the transport belt, taking in 1.5 iron plates per second, 1.5 iron gears per second. And then we need 1 machine making iron gears, taking in 2 iron plates per second, or 3 iron plates per second. So we have a total of 4.5 iron plates per second to make 1 transport belt. And we can see that also in game. Oh, this makes 2. Huh. That's where I messed that up. This makes 2. That changes a few things. Now we only actually needed a half a machine. But that accomplishes what we're trying to accomplish either way. Okay, so now let's copy this whole thing over here. This will be for the inserter. The inserter's recipe is a half a second. It needs 1 iron plate, 1 iron gear, and 1 electronic circuit. AKA green circuit. Output's 1. So we need 1 machine making inserters. And then we need this is linked to the right cell. It is. Okay. And then we need 1 or half a machine making iron gears. We could also calculate the electronic circuits needed here, but since most people will calculate the bus like we did when we calculated the electronic circuits earlier, oftentimes you'll just leave this like this and say, okay, well, I need 0.75 electronic circuits per second. Makes it simple. And it kind of that way it's kind of works the way that the game works. So in summary, for green science, we need 12 machines making the green science. We need a half a machine making transport belts, so you would double that, or you would just make that one machine. We need a half a machine making iron gears, so you would also make that one machine. You round up. Here we need one machine making inserters, and a half a machine making gears. So another way to do this would be to make one iron gear machine feed its gears into the transport belt and the inserter, and then you don't have to worry about having... then you can have one fewer machine for this array. Either way is valid. You could do a bit of a summary section here where you added up the amount of each item, each input item. So you could say, okay, well, I need 3.75, 4.5 iron plates per second, and 0.75 circuits per second. But that summary is going to change with every recipe you build in this type of spreadsheet. So trying to calculate that, or trying to set that up to be kind of universal would be quite a challenge. Okay, instead of clearing all this like I did the last time, I'm just going to duplicate it, and we'll clear just this portion. How about we actually delete the rows, so it deletes the colors as well. Now let's look at plastic again. Okay, plastic has 1 second craft time in a machine that has a machine speed of 1, and it outputs 2 plastic bars. It needs 1 coal and 20 petroleum gas. Okay, so 1 second. One cycle per second outputs 2. Let's say we want 15. We find out that we need 7.5 machines, which is exactly what we calculated with the Windows calculator. Now we know that we need 1 coal, 1. And we also know that we need petroleum gas. We need 20. So that means for this array, we need 7.5 coal per second and 150 petroleum gas per second. So that's a half a yellow belt of coal and what feels like some arbitrary number of petroleum gas. Now, what happens if you want to calculate the amount of petroleum gas you would need, or the amount of basic oil you would need in order to produce this much petroleum gas? Create a new sheet. Oh, great, Quad. That's what I was hoping for. I was hoping that this would help people to create a spreadsheet like this themselves, to understand everything kind of up front. All right, so we need 150 petroleum gas. So let's say 150 petroleum gas. And just so that we don't have to sit here and watch me type for 5 minutes, I'm going to grab this also from my notes. So in order to produce 150 petroleum gas, which is what we need for that recipe, we need to calculate the number of refineries in order to produce that much petroleum gas. So this formula is quite similar. We start out with the amount of petroleum gas we actually need, 150. And we divide that by the amount of time that it takes to craft. Wait a minute, that's not the right cell. The amount of petroleum gas that it takes to craft, or per craft of basic oil processing. And then we divide that by the amount of seconds that it takes to create that 40 petroleum gas. We can also divide it by actually we need to parentheticalize this part here. We can also divide it by the base crafting speed of the machine. But since it's 1, we really don't necessarily need that part of the formula. So this tells us that we need 18.75 refineries to produce 150 petroleum gas per second. Now, the problem with this is we have surplus heavy oil and surplus light oil that we need to deal with. And it's good to understand how much surplus there actually is. So if we look at the number of refineries that we're running, and I want to anchor this cell so I can copy this in a little bit, and we multiply that by the heavy oil output of basic oil processing, and then we divide that by let's see, we want to do the time divided by the base crafting speed, which again, since it's 1, we don't actually need to do that. We're producing 112.5 surplus heavy oil per second. These numbers are per second. And now since I did the cell reference locks on these cells, they will, when I copy and paste this, they will stick to those cells so that I don't have to edit those formulas to make sure that they reference the correct cells. The one cell that wasn't locked shifted down to the light oil. And since the light and heavy oil output the same quantity each time, it's the same number. But if I didn't do that, the number would be crazy. So we have to deal with this surplus heavy and light oil, at least for now. If they change the recipe the way they're proposing to change it, there is no heavy and light oil on this output, so that makes our lives a little bit easier because we don't have to deal with this. So just kind of keep this in mind, that you need enough tanks to store this much heavy and light oil, or at least for the starting of it, for the way the current oil processing works and the current chemical science works. Putting heavy oil and light oil into making solid fuel is the best way to handle these surplus products at this stage of the game. Now, what happens once you research advanced oil processing? What changes? Well, you produce a lot less heavy oil, you produce a bit more light oil, and a bit more petroleum gas. These formulas don't change at all. Make sure the references are correct, but we anchored this so that it locked to this needs, and these cells all stayed the same. These formulas did not change. But as you can see now, we need far fewer refineries to produce the same amount of petroleum gas. We need we produce far less heavy oil because of that drastic change there. We produce a bit more light oil. So at this point in the game, you're cracking, or you're making much more solid fuel out of light oil than you are out of heavy oil for chemical science, and you're still making plastic here with the petroleum gas that comes out of the refinery. That's all well and good, except that now we have the ability to do cracking. So let's look at the recipe for oil cracking. Pulled this from my notes so we don't have to watch me type it anymore. Heavy oil cracking takes 2 seconds. It has an input of 40 heavy oil and an output of 30 light oil. Light oil cracking takes 2 seconds. Has an input of 30 heavy oil and an output of 20 light oil. So now we can calculate the number of chemical plants we need to handle the cracking of the oil. So we start with the amount of heavy oil that we are producing. And then we divide that by the amount that is in each recipe. And I want to anchor this at column B. And we divide that by the amount of time that it takes to consume that amount of heavy oil. So this means we need 1.3 machines cracking heavy oil to consume this surplus heavy oil. Just over 1.3, so we would make 2 in this case. Now we can copy this cell here. We can copy this cell here. This tells us how many light oil machines we need in order to handle this light oil. But we also need to deal with this light oil. This 30 per second times 1.36 machines, we also need to deal with that. So in order to deal with that, we need to add that into this cell here. So now we'll add in the number of machines producing light oil from the cracking times the amount of light oil being produced, which is 30 per second, or 30 per recipe, excuse me, divided by the number of seconds it takes to produce that amount of oil. And that means we actually need 9.5. And if you noticed, that is simply 8.18 plus 1.36. That's actually fairly simple. So we could actually just add that. In the end of this formula, we could have just added this 1.36 into there. But I like to make sure that everyone understands where that comes from, where that oil, or where that additional number comes from. And it's from this output of 30 light oil every 2 seconds. So with this being 150, which is where we ended up here, this doesn't look very, very sort of appealing, sort of appetizing. Let me grab the right number here. Hold on just a second. If we were only needing 110, you would see some numbers that you might be familiar with from the Factorio cheat sheet. That is 10 refineries, 1 heavy oil cracking, and 7 light oil cracking. This is how those numbers were calculated. Well, maybe they did it better than I've done it, but this is sort of how those numbers are calculated to get that recommended number of machines, that recommended number of, or that recommended number of refineries. Let me find that part of the thing here. Of course, I scrolled. There it is. 10. Where is it? 10, 1, and 7. Right there. We just did the math that they did in order to create this guide. Now, we could actually do the same thing with the cracking with basic oil processing. There's nothing stopping us from doing the cracking on basic oil processing as well. However, the only thing stopping us is each of these take in 100 crude per recipe. So for every refinery that's running, we're consuming 100 crude every 5 seconds. No matter what the output is. So in using basic oil processing, even if we're getting everything cracked to petroleum gas, we're using 1,375 crude every 5 seconds. And here we're only using 1,000. But we don't know actually how much petroleum gas we're outputting with this setup, because this is just telling us how many refineries we need based on what the how much do we need based on what the refineries are outputting. Now let's look at what the total outputs are after we've cracked everything into petroleum gas. Now, of course, the heavy oil output is 0. We've consumed all the heavy oil here in the cracking process. Here in the cracking process. The light oil output is 0. We've consumed all the light oil by adding the additional machine in here, which is consuming what's being output here. We've consumed all of the light oil and all of the heavy oil. So how much petroleum gas are we actually producing in this scenario? We're producing... Oops. My focus wasn't on the spreadsheet. We're producing this number. Oops, anchor it. Plus this times this divided by this. I want to make sure I get my anchors correct here. Yeah. So we're producing 110 from the refineries themselves, from these 10 refineries. We're also producing 20 every 2 seconds times 7 machines. Does that make sense? So we're producing 140 divided by 2, which is 70 additional petroleum through the cracking process. So we end up with 180 petroleum gas after the cracking process, which is more than we needed. We could do the same thing with basic oil processing just by copying that formula over, since we did the anchors correctly. And so with basic oil processing, because of the additional heavy and light oil here, we're actually producing a bit more petroleum gas than advanced oil processing. But we're also consuming quite a bit more crude oil on the input side. Yeah, the whole cracking process. The whole heavy into light, and then all the light into petroleum gas. So that, adding those together, we're producing 70 more petroleum gas with advanced oil processing than we actually were looking to produce to feed the well, obviously we wanted 150, I think. So we're still producing more than we intended here. So, and this is what tools like Kirk McDonald and Helmod do for us. They step it down. They say, okay, well, now we know how much petroleum gas this complete cracking process produces. So we go from crude all the way to petroleum gas. So now let's step it down to only produce the amount of petroleum gas that we actually were desiring to produce. So instead of 13.6 refineries here, we actually want to take the amount of petroleum gas that we initially started with, or initially desired, and divide that by, let me make sure I get the right thing here, divide that by the amount of petroleum gas we're actually outputting. This gives us a percentage of the amount of petroleum gas that we desired compared to the amount we were actually producing. And then we can multiply that by the number of refineries that we calculated we needed. And that tells us we need 8.33 refineries. 8.33 refineries with all of the cracking process, which we'll calculate here in a second, with all the cracking process will produce 150 petroleum gas per second. That's what this is telling us. So then the next piece is heavy oil. Heavy oil is calculated kind of the same way. Heavy oil cracking, rather. We say that we, again, want that same ratio, but instead we're going to multiply it by this number of machines here to tell us we need 0.8333 heavy oil cracking. And then we'll do the same thing here. Actually, I can just copy. No, I need to fix this anchor first. Anchor it to 20. This tells us we need 5.833 light oil cracking. Now we can come to that same 10, 1, and 7 by adjusting this number up to 180. So now if we were desiring 180 petroleum gas with all of the refining and all of the cracking, there's the magic 10, 1, and 7 again. And we can actually copy these and paste them here and see the same number of machines if we were using basic oil processing. So with it, you can see the efficiency here with advanced oil processing because we need 20% more refineries. We need over 3 times, almost 4 times the number of heavy oil cracking, and we need a bit more, whatever that is, 1/5. Yeah, 1/5. It's another 20% of the number of light oil cracking machines in order to accomplish the same amount of petroleum gas. So not only is advanced oil processing more efficient on the input side, requiring that much less crude oil, but it's also more efficient on the electricity side to produce the same amount of petroleum gas. So yes, that's exactly right, Pep. So we need solid fuel for research. Solid fuel is best done with light. That's the part that I wasn't intending on, or that I didn't want to try and address because it's actually pretty complicated to say, well, we also need to output X amount of solid fuel for chemical science as well as plastic for chemical science. How do we take the light oil out of this recipe so that we can calculate how much refining we need to produce enough oil, for example, or enough oil products, for example, to make a targeted amount of chemical science. I mean, it can be done. We could, I suppose we could do it if we looked at the recipe for chemical science. We see that in 24 seconds, divided by 0.75, we produce 2 chemical science packs. We need one solid fuel. We need 3 advanced circuits, and we need 2 engine units. Well, the 1 solid fuel, which is interesting that they're making it out, or the game is suggesting making it out of heavy oil. The 1 solid fuel, we could calculate how much solid fuel we need to produce the, again, say 1.5 chemical science per second. And then we could calculate the amount of advanced circuits needed, and then we could step that recipe down into the amount of plastic needed, the amount of green circuits needed, the amount of copper needed, and as well as with the engine units, we could step those down into the amount of components needed, and then take the desired amount of petroleum gas from the plastic and the desired amount of light oil for the solid fuel, and come up with a light oil needs here and subtract that before we crack light oil into petroleum gas. That formula is getting to the point of complexity where I'm not sure I want to try and address that. Just the amount of kind of moving parts. It's a great thing to attempt to accomplish, but I'm not sure that I want to attempt to accomplish that here on stream. That's a little bit more complex than I was intending on. Just for kind of the fun of it, I did also do this math ahead of time with coal liquefaction, just to kind of compare the amount of the same items, which is where the heavy oil net comes into play, because coal liquefaction produces, I think it's 90 per second, but it consumes 25. So you have to, that's where the 65 comes from. Yeah, I actually put it in the formula here, 90 minus 25. So with the same thing here, we get the same answer, but instead we need, well, the math tells us we need 90 refineries. And that's because each refinery only produces 10 every 5 seconds, which is 2 per second. So we need, in order to get 180, we need 2. Exactly, Paps. That's why we're going to go into the first Kirk McDonald and then the mods, in-game mods, to show how to calculate this stuff using the tools, just because when you're getting into it with a spreadsheet, you have to be very careful, and it's a more complex calculation to do manually than I think most people will want to accomplish. So that's why I don't want to include it in this tutorial. So as you can see, there's a huge surplus of the other products, so we need a lot of cracking of those products in order to get it all down to petroleum gas, but then we're producing a ton of petroleum gas with all of that. So when we step it down, get to numbers that are similar, but they're still a lot larger than, and this, of course, this doesn't take into account the amount of coal we need to liquefy, nor the amount of fuel, whatever we use, if we use coal as a fuel or if we use solid fuel as a fuel, that we need to produce the steam for coal liquefaction. But if you have limited amounts of crude on your map, then this is the only way to accomplish this. You need use the crude you have to get basic oil going, to get advanced oil going, to get coal liquefaction researched, so that you can switch to this and start consuming coal. So these are of course quite in the same order of magnitude as the others, but you can see that it's much less efficient to do the same thing on coal liquefaction as it is even with basic and definitely with advanced oil processing. So that's kind of where I wanted to finish the section on the spreadsheet, is with calculating how to calculate the amount of oil you're producing, or the amount of oil you need in order to produce the amount of petroleum gas you need for plastic or for sulfuric acid. You could do the same thing here, producing the sulfur and the sulfuric acid, and then take that number of petroleum gas and input it here, and it'll tell you the amount of oil you need to set up in order to produce that much petroleum gas, to feed that much plastic and or sulfuric acid. In the end, it's the same. It's the same thing. So the next, after the spreadsheet, then I wanted to get into the sort of tools, the pre-built tools that you can use to do the same type of work without having to develop it yourself. But developing yourself, and I can fully admit to this because when I was preparing this tutorial, I did just this. I developed the spreadsheet myself once and got it working, got it balanced, got this to output 10, 1, and 7, so that I could agree with the math on that Kirk McDonald comes up with, that the Factorio cheat sheet comes up with, that Helmod comes up with, that the accepted governed outputs are the same.